they had that big, involved along with the speaking about the pictures in her field. These things about one of the women, all I meant to do and all. And one of the things we did was make, they arranged the satellite fly over that way.
Yeah.
They invited me to make a great, one of those great people that made, things on the ground. She wrote all of us to go, but only, so anyway,
well, my mom's birthday falls on 9/11. And so it's always kind of like, well, we celebrate her. We kind of like that. And really like, everything. She had asked me earlier this year because we went to a lot of games for work reasons. And then I went to two other times with friends, and she's like, games. I haven't taken them to the games like, and the last game they went to was the Rangers game in Dallas. And so I was like, I had to go on Sunday for work purposes to entertain clients that were in our suite. And there happened to be 4 tickets available, and I was already, I was like, I'll just take those 4 tickets from my parents. I'll go in to see the host for a little bit of evening, and then I'll go with my parents. And so that's what I did. But luckily, the tickets that we got were tickets I've never gotten for their home plate. So so I was excited. Those tickets go to your clients. You know, and I guess whatever clients were going, they didn't go, so they became with. So, like, you know, that was the orphan.
yeah, see the AC.
Yeah, we are the picture of another warming up right there. I mean, one of we can get referred to birthdays. It's not too bad. They're close, but it's right there. Like people who see in the camera.
Yeah.
TV, so working on the home should get some money. I'm only overtime. They worked out for work and they worked out for those money.
When we lived in Kentucky, years ago, it was right across the river from Cincinnati, and I worked at hospital, and I was the director of the chocolate center there, and my boss always got a hold, and he would take different groups of people, you know, from the hospital, to the ball, and to the one, they always had, house meetings. And we would take that, I got to see back then, today, the big real machine. So I had to see, one of those guys, because this deep for all things. The CP block, the block was really, okay, so that was the. While our kids were in high school, the Reds had a program for all the straight A students in the high schools in the area. And they got 2 free tickets to certain ball games during the season. That half a dozen. And then the string attached was that you could buy them for the kids could buy them for their families for the reduced price. That's cool. So of course, you know, we got high school kids that didn't really drive much, and so yeah, we got to see good and see quite a few of those things. Really,
You said for the Reds,
y'all
y'all lived out there at the time.
yeah, we lived in Carolina, Kentucky, which is just across the river from Cincinnati, Ohio.
Okay.
So we would go down to the park, the Dutch side, walk across the ridge and over to the stadium. Ball game. Very cool. So it was neat. Dad, did you bring that paper for Della?
Yes, I did.
I wrote myself a note and then promptly, ignored it. Did you hear any more from your people?
No, I don't expect to hear back until maybe the end of the month. We have a training on the 24th,
Oh, okay.
so more than likely they'll wait till after. And then my job, we're still not back. They're still pushing it.
Yeah.
They're still pushing the dates of us bringing the work. Now, it's optional. I could go to work if I wanted to. But. you know,
But why do that?
why-
Yeah, right.
I'm doing much more at home.
Yeah.
So really, it's
Yeah.
more on their benefit that I am saying, well, you don't take, yeah, you take lunch in your home. You don't have a social interaction, they're working more. And so I'm just like, I'm just saving some gas and some extra money until we have to do that. You know, some people are going in, but that's their choice.
Yeah. Yeah, our daughter really did not like to work from home, so she really prefers to go, but there are days I think she's one of the few people in
Yeah,
there, because so many of them, because she did administration, so many of them do work. You know.
well, that is the thing, like, if I go to work and I say, well. There's really not many people there, so they're not really getting. What
Yeah.
you're supposed to get out of this work, like face to face interaction, I'm not really getting it. I mean, I know I'm welcome, but there's a little bit that.
I did, he brought me. I really enjoyed reading this chapter on Judaism.
I haven't finished.
So,
Okay, let's get started if I can find all the stuff.
so much of it is,
Okay,
Like, right, you can't, but.
and there's just so much in this that, you know, I knew about this, that,
all right. Well, we can,
how it has impacted life, really, you know, so much. That, I really,
we'll go ahead and dive in. Like Christianity, Judaism is a historical religion. It arises in history, founds its ideas on what happens in history, at least as it understands it. Israel, the nation, emerges around 1000 BCE, and this is Jewish counting, or now, of course, secular counting. So the BCE stands for before the Common Era, since we can't be Christian in our time factors anymore. Saul and David solidify a kingdom. Small country with some cohesive reality. In their tradition, they believe it goes back to at least 500 years before, and depending on the chronology that you use, and there's some actual chronology problems in the Bible itself about this. You begin with Abraham. Many of his descendants were among a collection of slaves who escaped from Egypt. Various dates for that are given, again, depending on what chronology you follow. 1500, 1200 or so. Even the Bible itself is fairly clear that there were more than just descendants of Abraham who leave. And this group of people in their tradition have a traumatic encounter with a divine being, Yahweh, as our best guess. At Sinai in the Exodus tradition, the place is called Horeb in the book of Deuteronomy and the tradition that grows from it. And here these people are offered, according to their tradition, a covenant with this deity to be a special people of his among all the other nations of the world. And associated with that covenant is a tradition of morality and religion centered in sacrificial cults and purifications and festivals, both positive and negative. At this point, it's a good place to look at just exactly what emerges here in terms of their theology and their life. And so we're going to look at Smith's two areas. Actually, there's three where he sees meaning in God, meaning in history, and meaning in life, which he rephrases as hallowing of life because he looks at it from that direction. Did you see the clause in his discussion about the God of Israel, how he's misread as Jehovah?
Yeah.
And there's a double twist to that. The counter letters in English alphabet to the four letters of this God's name in Hebrew are YHWH. Exactly how that was pronounced, even in Judaism, depends on the tradition that you follow as to how particularly this W was pronounced. Is it pronounced as a W or as a V? Exactly how did you pronounce this H? When this was finally transcribed into English letters, it was done with the letters J, H, W, or sometimes V, H. And in the tradition that you get Jehovah, it was done as JHVH. Same four letters, representing the same sounds. The J was not our English J sound. The J was chosen because in the language that this transcriber was doing it in, the J was pronounced as a Y sound. So when it got brought over into English as JHVH, we then pronounced it differently. Now, the vowels are not guesswork, they're substitution. The Jewish tradition, well before the time of Jesus, stopped pronouncing this name, lest they take it in vain. And so their tradition was to read the word our Lord here instead of the name. They read the word our Lord. And when they started putting little vowel markings in their text, which weren't there originally, in order for the Jewish Hebrew reader to realize how he should say this word, they put the vowel letters for the word our Lord there with the Hebrew letters for the name of God. So you had a combination word. So the vowels of Jehovah, E-O-A, are taken from the word God, not from the name of God, but from the word Lord. This God they encounter, and in their tradition, they believe Abraham previously had encountered, was unique in several ways to the ancient Near East. The most obvious way, and the way that is most often pointed to, is his singularity. The ancients, in order to understand, describe deity, supernatural, compartmentalize the supernatural with reference to those events in existence that they experienced. And so you have both the natural elements that they constantly had to relate to, the sun, the moon, the stars, the winds, the rain, et cetera, processes of life that relate to that, i.e. rain and crops growing, for instance. And then the experiences of humanity, what we did. Farming and fighting and loving, and so all of the emotions that we experience and all of our exchanges with the natural world were connected to deities. And there are obviously a multitude of those experiences. And so they ended up with multitudes of gods. This Hebrew deity was singular. Now, the verse that's most often quoted for that, Deuteronomy 6:5, listen up, O Israel, Yahweh, your God is one, is not the best translation for that. Because that would really be redundant, because all the gods were singular. There was only one God of the sun or one God of the moon in whichever country, mythological tradition you lived in. So for Yahweh, and the word there is Yahweh, for Yahweh to say he's one would be no different than any of the other gods. They were all singular too. So the best translation for that verse is Yahweh, the God, Yahweh is your God alone. Yahweh is God, God alone, not simply one God. But very clearly in Scripture, in this tradition of the Jews, you get the strong emphasis that becomes stronger and stronger that this God is alone. He's not just way more powerful than the other gods. He's not just the God who made these gods. He's the only God. And in his nature, because he is the creator of everything, there is what the theologians call a transcendence, a distance between him and what is. He's not the rain, he's not the sun, he's not even in the sun. He's beyond the sun, he's above the sun, he made the sun. Which of course is the point you see when the Israelites begin to develop this you have the Genesis 1 story, where God is singular and he brings everything into being. So he's powerful. But he's personal. Now, here you get the strange, interesting twist. The gods of the other worlds of the day were in our image. Some of them would be given animal features, on lion's head or something like that, snakes for hair, things like that. But their basic concept was still in our image. That is, they were human in form. But more importantly, they were like us in how they acted. They had all of our foibles, all of our mean streaks, as well as some of our good streaks. Whereas in the Bible story, we're in the image of God, which sets totally different tone. But this God is more personal than the other gods because he personally, individually, openly, actively relates to human beings on a very personal basis. In fact, he makes a covenant with this group of people. He's really involved with concern and care. And because he's not like us, his morality is not like us. Is a striking character that exceeds anything that we have imagined. Look at that remarkable passage in Exodus 34, where he reveals himself to Moses, not only in some kind of visual way, but more importantly, in an audible way of a description. A God of compassion and love and mercy, forgiving sin, as well as holding sinners responsible. And because he made this world and the people of this world, he's active in all of the affairs of this world, not just the natural things, but the human things. And thus, for the Israelites, there is a very significant different view of history. For history is not just an ongoing cycle of the way things happen. History becomes the purposeful activity of a creator God. And with respect to the humans, because this God has this character, this morality, history has for human beings the essential character of their responding to and relating to this God. So there becomes real responsibility for how we behave in relationship to him. This is made most clearly obvious in the story of the giving of the Ten Commandments, which aren't given as some universal code. They are given as the environment in which this people relate to this God. And therefore, significant moral oughtness arises in the human environment. This isn't just a world that you just make the best of. This isn't a world that cannot be changed, because there is a God who has purpose in this world that includes us. And therefore, what happens in this world is malleable. Between God and humans, history can be developed. It can be bent. It can be shaped. And humans are significantly responsible for that in terms of how they relate to this deity who brought all this into being. And so history becomes opportunity, significant opportunity. But not just history, all of life. God made this world and put human beings in this world to care for this world. The Hebrew story in Genesis 1 can even use the word rule this world. And so everything in this world's existence is ours because God gave it to us. Everything in this world has to take into consideration that it's ours because it was given to us, and therefore we are responsible in how we use it with reference to this God. And that includes all of life. 24/7, 365, for however many years you live. Nothing is exempt. And so when Israel is given rituals to express and reinforce this totality of holy life, of hallowed life, it's all special because it's all the product of the divine creator. They have things that touch all of life. They're not just the sacrifices, special cults carried on in a tent or later a temple that have to do with simply honoring God or fellowshipping with God or somehow removing the guilt or the guiltiness of sin. There are all kinds of regulations about various aspects of life, all kinds of diseases, for instance. You've read through Leviticus, haven't you, on occasion, to see, the moles, the things on the walls, on the skin. They're the purifications of the women in their monthly period, in their giving birth to a child. There are all kinds of issues of what you eat, can't eat. There are matters of dress. And there are even things as mundane as the fact that in the camp you have to build the latrine in such a way, in such a distance from the people, and all that kind of stuff. It's all there, all of life. The celebrations, both positive and negative. That's why I use celebration and repentance. Cover a host of things. Booths, for instance, is a memory of what you did back years ago when you wandered in the wilderness. The Sabbath is utterly unique in the ancient world. There's no culture that ever said, don't work on this day. Now, they would have occasional holidays, but not something fixed. And notice the emphasis of the Sabbath day is not religious at all. It's don't work. And you can't make anybody else work either for you on that day, not even your animals. This changes the whole rhythm of life. Just stop work. Their major Passover feast, first fruits, the New Year, the Atonement Day, booths. There were regulations about tithes, and it wasn't just a matter of giving the money. If you look at like Deuteronomy 14 or 26, you gather the tithes and you throw a big party, and you invite all the poor people and all the people who don't have jobs, and you invite them to the party. There were the regulations of, when you're cutting down the grain, you have to leave the corners. When you go through the orchard, you got to pick when you go, and you can only go once. And anything that's left on the tree because it wasn't ripe, you have to leave. And the people who don't have orchards can come get it. Every aspect of life is addressed in often number of ways. This is the world view that emerges in these people. Not perfectly. It's very clear, for instance, that the Sabbath of years, when they were supposed to let the fields lay fallow and not even plant a crop that year, was not always, if ever, followed to any significant degree. There are certainly records that mention that they weren't always doing one of these right or wrong. The message of the prophets is you're really not doing this at all, and because of this, you're going to lose all the privileges that are attached to it. But it emerges, and in an apologetic for it, one of the issues that you have to deal with is, where did all this stuff come from if in fact it was never being done? With this, and this doesn't all come quickly, the tradition presents to it as major developments all in the time of the wilderness and coming into the land. Clearly, some of that expands later on. For instance, the temple, and a great deal of the liturgy of the temple is much later. After their movement into the land, and even the story tells us this didn't happen totally and completely and suddenly, and there's a raging argument over this by the historians and the archaeologists nowadays, and there are infinite problems involved in those discussions and disagreements. But under Saul and then David, a cohesive community, nation, coalition of tribal groups emerges. David solidifies it by building a new capital city, in a city that the Jews, these people, have never lived in any significant degree. It's not their city. He conquers it. His son builds a temple there. But this nationhood lasts barely 100 years before it dissolves with a segment of, and the general idea is 10 tribes. You can't really make it work out quite that way. Break off from the king who rules in David's dynasty and retain the name Israel. And this group of people, significant number of them, the important people, are exiled by the Assyrian Empire in 721. and to a great degree, quote, disappear. The unity, integrity of this group of people fades significantly. The southern group, who call themselves Judah, exists for nearly 100 years, and then they're carried exile by the Babylonians. Now, in neither case was everybody carried off. In most likelihood, they carried off only the aristocracy. Clearly, they carry off the priesthood in the north because the king brings them back, according to the story. And the landowners, the artisans, the courtesans, the businessmen, the traders, that kind of thing. So what's left is the people who they don't think would ever merge themselves into a resistance group and become anything. But it's important to remember that these people are there because when this group from Judah come back, there are relatives in the land. A group of those who were carried off into Babylon come back in 536, rebuild the temple, reestablish a life and commerce as a sub-jurisdiction under the Persians, who have gained control of the Middle East by that time. In fact, it's under the Persians that they're allowed to go back. And it's under their influence because they make Assyrian, they make Aramaic, which is an alphabet language as opposed to the language of the Assyrians. They make it an official language, and the Jews adopt the alphabet, even though they retain some of the other features. They pretty much adopt Aramaic, which is the language then of Jesus' day. The Persians are conquered by Alexander, who gains control of the Middle East. And when he dies, his whole expanse is divided up among the Greeks. In the Far East, the family of the Seleucid Greeks rule Syria over into Babylon and Persia. Ptolemaic Greeks rule Egypt. And then there's another group that rule Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey. And then there's another group who get Alexander's homeland, Greece, Macedonia, and that part of the world. And this is the situation up to just before Jesus' day. During this period of time, we see a pretty clear emergence of a collection of scrolls that are recognized as significant because they're being copied with some degree of regularity. They're apparently being organized into 3 collections. There's a collection of 5 scrolls attributed to Moses, the Torah, or the teachings. Unfortunately, it got mistranslated in English as law. There's a group of historical and prophetical writings that are attributed to various writers. Some of them are anonymous, and they're collected into a group called the prophets. In Hebrew, it was the Nevi'im. And that includes what we have in the English Bible as our books of history: Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Kings. And then there was a miscellaneous collection of the rest of the stuff like we have in our Old Testament, like the book of Psalm, like a collection of Psalms and the Song of Solomon. It also included a book that we know as the prophet Daniel, and it included a a second writing of the history, which we now call the book of Chronicles, First and Second Chronicles. And these were just called the writings. How firmly, aside from the quote books of Moses, or the book of Moses, the 5 writings of the Torah, how firm these 2 collections were in what was in and what was out, and how they were understood and how they were used, is still pretty ambiguous. Eventually, this collection is given the name of the Tanakh, which are the 3 letters of the Hebrew words Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. But again, how they were understood is a little bit difficult to figure out. Clearly, Torah has a central authority, emerging all the way back to the time of the return in 536, because there are, quote, books of Moses, book of Moses, read by Ezra, enforced by Nehemiah, as clearly authoritative. But we don't know exactly what the scope of that material was either. Additionally, in this period before Jesus, in the struggle to apply the writings of the Torah, especially, to daily life, which has significantly changed in the near 1,000 years since Moses' day, when some of this stuff was written, there has emerged the tradition that at the giving of the law, Sinai, Horeb, 2 sets were given. One was written and one was oral. And the oral one was passed on orally, never got written down, wasn't supposed to be written down. And it's this tradition in the New Testament known as the tradition of the elders that forms the basis for a lot of the specifications that we see in the New Testament that aren't in the Old Testament. It was this oral tradition that had been built up. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. One clear indication that these scrolls, and remember, they were individual scrolls. There was a scroll that we call Genesis. There was a scroll that we call Exodus. There was a scroll that we call Samuel. In fact, there were probably 2 scrolls of Samuel. How many people had all of these scrolls? How many other places even had but a few of them? We don't know. But they were clearly significant because in the 3rd century before Jesus, these began to be translated into the Greek language for Jews who couldn't read Hebrew anymore. This is known as the Septuagint, which is simply the Latin for 70, on the tradition that 70 scholars translated it. During this period of time, there are a number of developments that arise way out of the time of the exile. In the time of the exile, remember, Jeremiah tells us that some of the people who were left in Babylon, some of the rulers that were left in Israel and Judah by the Babylonians rebelled, and in fear for their lives, they ran off to Egypt. So there are now a significant number of Jews in Palestine. There are a significant number of Jews in Babylon, and we know there are Jews in Egypt, as well as other parts of the Near Eastern world. late 175 years before Jesus, one of those Seleucid kings tries to repress Judaism in their homeland. It leads to a revolt by a family of Jewish priests by the name of Hasmoneans. One of them, Judas, the son of the original priest who starts it, gets nicknamed the Maccabean, and so sometimes these are talked about as the Maccabeans, mainly because two books that the books of Maccabees that show up in some of the groups of the Old Testament are given that name, and so this name persists. They actually succeed in defeating the Syrian, the Greek, Eastern Greek rulers. They're able to renew the temple practice that has been converted to a pagan place. And for about 100 years, they're able to rule independently as a country. When the grandson of one of these Maccabeans dies, his wife takes over, and she passes on some control of the country to one son and some of the control of the country to another son. And the upshot of the various conflicts that are raging is a civil war in which some of the leaders go to the Roman Pompey, who's up in Lebanon area, and invite him to come down to Jerusalem and take over. And he does. And so the Romans take over and then farm it out. And you know the story of Herod the Great, who's a very clever politician, and he gets in control. And what's behind his ability to do this is that during this period of time that the Hasmoneans are ruling, the country that Herod is a native to the south, Idumea, the Jews, the Hasmonean rulers conquer that country and force a lot of people to become Jews. And they do the same thing in the north in Galilee. They conquer it from the Greek rule that's there, and they impose Judaism, just like, you know, they were being oppressed. Now they enforce it. And it's out of that Herod then turns the tables on them and takes back over. Judaism that emerges by the time of Jesus is a real variegated mishmash. The temple that Herod has rebuilt very lavishly has extensive sacrifices and festivals and events and activities with it. Synagogues have come into existence. We don't know when or why or how, but these gathering places for Sabbath day gatherings, for reading scripture and for prayer, and for schools during the week have become pretty common. And we find these groups emerging that we see some in the New Testament. These names are derived from Jewish historian Josephus, who discusses a lot of this. Undoubtedly, there were others. And large range of people who don't belong to any of these groups, aren't influenced by any of these groups, and to what degree they are adhering to Old Testament Judaism, what foods they eat, what dress they have, how they observe the Sabbath day, because they didn't write records, they didn't keep diaries to survive. We don't know to what degree this was going on. It appears that the largest, most influential group, the Pharisees, have arisen out of the view that all Israel should be priests to God. They're recovering this whole idea of the Old Testament that God is the God of life. All of life should be holy. And since all Israel in Exodus 19 was to be a priest for God, then everybody should be like that. So these are the holiness people. They don't have a structure. They have their students of the law, the men who more actively pursue this. They're the promoters of the oral law, the traditions of the fathers. They frequently have differences of agreement with the Sadducees, who seem to be the principal supporters of the priesthood, the temple activities, maybe of the aristocracy. Josephus says there's this group of Essenes that seem to have withdrawn, and since now we've found a village where we found some scrolls, the Essenes have become a very popular group, even though the scholars still debate whether the Dead Sea Scrolls really belong to them or not. And then there were various less religious, more politically oriented groups that are mentioned. One place we have the Herodians, in another place we have the Zealots. The Zealots actually become a more organized party and eventually lead to a rebellion that leads to the destruction of the temple, mainly by Jewish partisans as much as by the Romans in terms of the actual destruction. This is repeated in 134, the result of which is that Jerusalem is ultimately totally destroyed, rebuilt as a pagan city. Jews aren't allowed to live there. And in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple, which means now you can't have sacrifices, just like you couldn't have when they went into exile in Babylon. Rabbis of Pharisee persuasion reform Jewish faith without a temple and a sacrificial cult. Two names that you may see eventually in some place or another, Yohanan Zakkai and Joseph Akiba are active in this. And thus you have the origins of Orthodox Judaism, which has as its authority 4 basic features. The Torah, which is augmented by the rest of the Hebrew Bible, the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim, the prophets and the writings. They, of course, were adopted, the oral Torah. And even though it, for another 100 years, 150 years, they keep it oral, eventually they write it down in a document called the Mishnah. Let me see here. I've got a picture of a page of that if you'd like to see what it looks like. Let me see if I can bring you back here. Where'd it go? Here it is. This is one of the tractates. This is translated in English, of course. The whole thing's in English now. All these Jewish writings are in English now. You can get them on that website that I gave you at the beginning, Sacred Works. You can get them on any number of Jewish websites. This is the Shema. This is the prayer that you're to say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one." This is what it looks like. this is written down. And then within a couple of hundred years, there are discussions about how you're supposed to understand it. And so they developed the Talmud, which has the Mishnah here in the middle. Here it is in English with the descriptions of what's there. Here's the Mishnah, and then there's various commentaries about this. This Rashi is a commentator who doesn't come in until the 11th century. There are notes from other people. And the Talmud then is the Mishnah with some initial commentaries. And this becomes fundamental authority for Judaism. Okay. But because life doesn't stand still, the Torah, the Talmud, is going to face questions in the 15th century in countries other than the Middle East that weren't being asked. So what do you do there? So over the centuries, the Jews put together legal renderings. You have a question about how to do something, or whether or not you should do it, or whether it was good or bad. And it's an important question. Or a rabbi thinks it's an important question. And so you put together a collection of authorities, scholars, who discuss it, and they render a decision, a response. And so now you have volume after volume after volume of responses. In addition, because now for a couple of hundred years and further on for several more hundred years, the Jews have been speaking Aramaic, they eventually have to have the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, translated into Aramaic. So you have these Targumim. And then, because you want to have explanations about these various books, you end up with these commentaries, the Midrashim, on the Bible. In that century after the destruction of Jerusalem, rabbis in Jerusalem and who moved away to other areas in Galilee are able to retain significant authority. But gradually they lose out and the learning center shifts back to Babylon. And it's there that the Talmud eventually emerges as we have it today. There was one also arose in Palestine, but it almost disappeared to the point we didn't find it for a long time. In the 7th century, Islam begins. Judaism begins to spread with conversions in a number of places. Ethiopia, remember, after Israel is reopened in 48, we have a large number of Jews that are brought back from Ethiopia. In southern Russia, there's a significant kingdom of Khazars who convert to Judaism. And because of the growth of Islam, they spread all over this area, even into Spain. And under the initial rule of Islam in Spain, the Jews become very prolific. In the 9th century in Palestine, in Babylon, the Mesopotamia area, there is a revolt against the oral law arises. And there is a reformation, a restoration group of Jews who revert back to the Bible only. In the Islamic rule in the 9th century, a number of Jewish scholars are active in translating Roman and Greek classics into Arabic for the Muslims. You get this ebb and flow as Jews in various places under Islam, under Christianity, are oppressed in various ways. And so you get them moving around. When the Crusades go to try to recapture the Holy Land, they're not reluctant to slaughter Jews along the way. Partly under the pressure of these developments, you get a new development in Judaism of significant mysticism, which isn't just like the mysticism in Christianity, where the person becomes very, 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 very personal with Jesus. They have visions, they talk to Jesus, they pray directly, this kind of thing. The mysticism of the Kabbalah becomes very expansive. All kinds of ideas are developed within it. Let me show you one of their pages. Here we go. Here's one of their diagrams. And you have a whole book of this kind of thing, where all kinds of things are explained, all kinds of numbers in the Bible are given significance, all kinds of connections are made between various things. And it's still followed by a lot of people who consider themselves very loyal Jews. In the 11th century, you get a French Jew that we just mentioned. He's now the major commentator of the Talmud. Maimonides is one in Spain who not only writes in Hebrew, but in Arabic. There's another wave of persecution in the 13th century. The king and queen who sent Columbus west also expelled all the Jews or forced them to convert. So you get a massive movement back to the Middle East from there or up into Europe. New centers develop. And because you see you're 1,000, now you're 1,500 years removed from first century Judaism, you've got Jews that have gone from the Middle East to Spain and are now going back. You've got Jews that arose in a foreign culture in southern Russia. So you have all kinds of cultural language differences. And in the 16th and the 17th century, as you get various persecutions, you get all kinds of movements going back and forth. These great Jewish centers in France and in Germany get pushed to Eastern Europe. And so now you have the great Jewish centers in Poland that play such a prominent role in the Holocaust. In the 18th century in Germany, you get a number of Jews who are, because of their educational and their economic prowess, are being able to break out of the ghettoization that's often been typical of the situation, and you get an assimilation into the culture. And at the other end, you get an assimilation that freezes at the culture of that day, the Hasidim. Adopt a great deal of the culture of the day, but then they lock it in. And so today they still are like the Amish. They do 1700 way of doing things. Out of this assimilation movement in the middle 1800s, you get a Judaism that emphasizes the spiritual, moral, de-emphasizes the physical and the ritual. And Reform Judaism develops, which is probably the way you will encounter Judaism in America. It really takes off here. Now you have Orthodox Judaism and Reform Judaism, and there are a lot of people uncomfortable with both. And so in 1885, there's a middle movement that begins to emerge, now called Conservative Judaism. And actually now there are some other groups that have grown out of that, a super liberal group that doesn't think Reform Judaism is free enough. And so they've even gone further. So you see in Judaism the same thing you saw in Christianity. In an attempt to live within the cultures that you're in, which constantly are being changed because you're moving. Sometimes of your own free will to take advantage of opportunities. Frequently in the case of Jews, you're moving because you have to. You have no choice. The army shows up at the gate one day and says, grab what you can grab, you're leaving. And so you have Jews who live in countries where they're foreigners, and yet they're Jews. And so you're going to have those who, like in Jesus' day, are willing to speak Greek and wear Greek clothes and maybe not worry so much about whether they're in a crowd of Jews or non-Jews. And so in each one of these countries, in each of these cultures, you get people who are significantly different and who are not so comfortable with other Jews. By 1900, you begin to get this a rise of Zionism, which is a movement that says, hey, we're not welcome anywhere. Let's go back and take over the land that God gave us to begin with. And that becomes a very aggressive effort after World War I, when Britain is ceded the control of the Eastern Levant, Lebanon and Palestine. And basically, as a result of the terrible oppression of Nazi Germany in the 40s through the middle 50s, the 30s through the middle 40s, the effort increases to the place that the United Nations finally recognizes a homeland for the Jews in the Eastern Levant.
So did that happen because of the Zionism?
Yes, partly because of Zionism, because the Zionist movement between the wars was very aggressive in bringing in Jews to Palestine. They brought them in by the boatload, and Britain was trying to stop them. And there are all kinds of conflicts arise between the Zionist Jews and Britain, because Britain is trying to preserve Palestine the way it was at the end of World War I, mainly Islamic in population. And the Jews, of course, are trying to change that and take it over. So a great deal of the conflict you still see in the Middle East today is the carryover of the conflict that arose clear back in the early 1900s when Jews began to make serious, aggressive efforts to regain a presence in the Middle East. And that means they aren't always nice about coming up to the people who own this property and saying, would you sell it to me? And offering a price that they would accept and selling it to them. There were efforts to take it over, just like there is today. And so the quote Palestinian Muslim has a 100-year tradition of being displaced by a Jew whose people haven't lived in that country for 2,000 years. His family's been there for 500 years or 700 years or whatever. And of course, you see, there's no real way of knowing how many of those, quote, Palestinians are not racially first-century Jews who converted somewhere back to Islam.
So there's not really.
Or in fact, never converted. They just stopped following Jewish tradition. They became a nun and living in a country where Arabic was spoken. They grew up speaking Arabic and their Jewish tradition just disappeared. And you have no idea how many people are like that. But that's why the conflict is so intractable. Is that now you have 100 years of everybody's got more than one horror story to tell of how they got mistreated by the other side. And the real tragedy, of course, is the fact that so little effort was done to really help those people who were displaced. And many of those people who were displaced theoretically didn't need to be displaced. They just were afraid that they would be displaced. And if they had stayed, there would have been pressures to displace them. And so again, you have stories and neither the funds nor the real willingness to try to, okay, let's make the best of where we are now. Let's figure out how we can do that. So now you have, what, 5 generations of displaced people. Now, see, we had hundreds of thousands of people displaced after World War II. All kinds of efforts were made to assimilate them somewhere, settle them somewhere under some circumstance, and to do it in a way that you didn't have ongoing conflict. But we didn't do that in the Middle East. And so we're now inheriting the whirlwind of what we have. So now you have a Judaism varied in a whole variety of ways, centered around the Sabbath, around the synagogue and the home. All the major festivals of the temple have been absorbed into the home. The Sabbath, the synagogue has become a community center And Judaism has found forgiveness in righteousness, acts of kindness. And they find all of this rooted in the Old Testament. It's not, but the reality is that Orthodox Judaism is as different from the Old Testament as Christianity is. That's not obvious because they still observe the festivals, and of course Christianity doesn't. But they clearly, you see, observe them in significantly different ways. The three feasts of the Old Testament were supposed to take place at the temple. Well, they don't do that, obviously. There's no way you can replicate a sacrifice system. You don't have a place where you can sacrifice animals. And so, in that way, they are significantly different from Old Testament Judaism. Because they grow out of this company of scholars, the study of Torah becomes a central feature of the Jewish life. And even as that is jettisoned by common people to a significant degree, certainly by Reform Judaism to a significant degree, this spirit of learning survives. And so Judaism is at the forefront of education, even to this day. In areas like New York City, for instance, where there were huge, large Jewish communities, especially between the war and then after World War II, it was not uncommon to find the vast majority of the teachers in the school system were Jewish. They weren't there promoting Judaism. They were teachers. They were secularists in terms of worldview, maybe. They might not even have been significantly observant Jews, but they grew up in Jewish families who honored their Judaism, their learning. And so you shouldn't be surprised to find that in respect to the percentage of people who identify as Jews in America, the number of people who won Nobel Prizes in America is a far, far higher percentage of those who identify themselves as Jews than in the population. Because of this central focus that we'll look at on righteousness, you should not be surprised to find a lot of Jews become attorneys.
They become what?
Attorneys, because they have this inbred commitment to justice. You shouldn't have been surprised to find a lot of Jews at the forefront of civil rights, because they have this inbred commitment to justice. You shouldn't be surprised to find them involved in women's lib, because they have this built-in commitment to liberation, freedom. Goes all the way back to their focus on the Passover, their liberation from Egypt. God is the God of liberty. The liberation theology of the South, of Southern America, was heavily influenced by Jewish writers, even though they weren't Christians. Okay, any questions? Next week, we'll look at the rest of the chapter where Smith develops these prominent ideas that arise out of this history.
And now we begin,
Pardon?
what page?
Well, it starts almost at the beginning. Because we'll touch on again the meaning of God, the meaning in God. What is this God that they see? And that, of course, has been in modern Judaism somewhat modified, especially as we experience it here in America. Okay, Kimberly and Jonathan. And I don't have. Let me go see if I can find. Roll this. I didn't see one.
I read, a lot of, reading, about, especially women in, all the Bible from Eve to the ladies in the East, and, I found a series of, 4 books about, that were written about women in the silent period between, Malachi and Jesus coming. One of them's about Judah Maccabee's life. And one of them's about Salome, who was the woman who was the queen that he mentioned, that he did mention her by name. Here she had peace in the Holy Land. And
See you ladies next week, I hope.
I'm reading one right now about Herod, the wife of Herod, and then the last one will be about I forgot who it is. But anyway, I didn't know all that. 50 years, I just didn't know all that much about Herod. Wow. And I'm enjoying it so much. So a lot of what he mentioned tonight about how the Jews were under the rule of Egypt and Babylon and all that is Cleopatra. Read one that I'm reading one about. The one I'm reading right now is about Cleopatra's maid.
Cleopatra was Jewish.
No,
Or maybe.
The maid was.